Well, David, thank you so much for those kind words. I'm really delighted to be here in this wonderful university, and we've got a great topic, so I'm going to get straight into it. The future of urban development is the title I've got up here, but, or is it? No, it isn't. I guess my PowerPoint will arrive. There we go, future of developing cities. I'm just going to run through what I have time for, which is the key broad elements of what we're faced with in terms of urban development. The Vice Chancellor has referred to climate change, and that is one of the big challenges, but we are faced with a whole series of challenges. So let's just take a look at what I consider to be the biggest challenge and the biggest driver for change of the 21st century, and that is demographics, not population as such. See, I think the big new information is that population growth is effectively under control. Across the world now, the average number of children per woman for the whole world is now 2.2. 2.1 is the number required to give a stable population. So we can be pretty confident about this IASA prediction of around 9 billion, 9.5 billion by mid-century. This is simply the under 15-year-old cohort replacing, and that's 2 billion, replacing a 1 billion cohort at the top end of the age scale as they get older. But there's another piece of the demographics that is critical to what we're discussing, and that's the growth of the middle class. And this is happening at, I would say, at both a wonderful rate and a frightening rate. So 1 billion people, middle class I'm defining as those who spend between $10 and $100 a day, 1 billion in the year 2000, we passed 2 billion last year. So we've already doubled the number of middle class consumers on the planet in just 13 years. And the projection going forward on this graph takes us close to 5 billion by 2030. That's pretty soon. And so preparing a world with this number, 5 times as many middle-class consumers, most of whom will be urban dwellers, in a very short space of time, it's a challenge the world has never faced before. But it's also facing this challenge at a time when this demographic pressure has already produced a whole series of challenges, and those challenges are coming at us all at once. So let's just get on to my slide, which deals with the numbers living in cities. So 2008, of the 6.5 billion people, we had more than 50% living in cities. 2050, of the 9 billion, 70% in cities. So there's the expected rapid growth in urban development. So we've got two issues. We've got the old world, where not much growth is happening, and the new world, largely at the moment, the Asia-Pacific region, where 95% of the new middle class are, but Africa coming along very rapidly behind. That new world of Asia-Pacific and Africa is where urban development is going to be happening at a rate we have never seen before. Now, this challenge has got to be seen as an opportunity, but it's something that we have got profoundly with us now. It's not an opportunity we can start talking about now. We actually have to begin to act on this opportunity, because it's all going to pass us by in a flash. If we don't turn this into an opportunity, we're going to allow a problem or a whole bunch of problems to fester and wound the development of societies around the world. Now, climate change has already been mentioned, and so let me get off my own patch right away and say, well, we've got this big risk. This is the rising sea level in blue, taking us back to 1870. Interesting, where did this data come from? The old data comes from the historical records left around the British Empire by the British, who measured everything in sight and recorded it very well. And that historical record was collected by the Proudman Institute fairly recently. And they put it all together with satellite data. You'll see the rise in sea level is really very substantial and is the best measure, I would suggest, of climate change, right? Because the heat capacity of the oceans means that as the temperature of the oceans goes up, this is a very reliable thermometer. So this is a very good measurement. The others in red are also from the ancient empire data, which is air temperatures, always carefully measured, 6 foot above ground, but in the shade. So, but because of the low heat capacity of the air, this wanders all over the place. But we know we've already had a 0.8 degrees centigrade temperature rise, sea level rise of 25 centimeters, and 80% of our existing cities are on coastlines under threat as that curve continues to go upwards. And there's already one of the challenges as we look at urban development alongside meeting the challenges of the future, which I'm going to use the phrase future-proofing. How do we future-proof our cities against the challenges that we know are in the pipeline? Now, that would be a problem of a magnitude that we could encompass, I would have thought, with some good engineering expertise. But the problem is in the following slide. And this is the demographic pressure of the rising consumers. It means that we have a whole bunch of challenges coming at us at the same time. So the consumers are creating conflicts over water resource. We simply need more fresh water because of more middle-class consumption. We all know that a kilogram of beef takes 12,000 litres of fresh water to produce. Yes, I think we should stop eating beef. But it's rising consumer behaviour, changing patterns of food consumption that is a massive challenge in this area. Energy security and supply. We know that in South Australia they've had 14 years of drought, no longer a place to farm and provide vegetables and fruit for all of the Australians, but difficult to provide fresh water for the urban environment as well. And so even the cities of Melbourne are very water stressed at the moment because of the successive years of drought. Now you could say, well, let's deal with this by just converting seawater into fresh water, but of course that's a very energy intensive process. And one of the features of this diagram is that it's what us physicists call a many-body problem. It's all interactive. So as you start dealing with water resource by converting salt water into fresh water, in Australia you use coal to do that. In the Middle East you use oil to do that. And so you're converting energy resource into water to meet the shortage of demand. Now the same applies all around the carousel that I'm showing you there. So as we start looking at food production, pressure on land, pressure on water, pressure on energy resources, we mustn't forget that transport is a key part of food production. And so each one of these impacts on the other. And what is happening already, this isn't tomorrow's problem, is that we're seeing that commodity prices today are higher in real terms than they have been for a very long time. So in terms of a basket of commodities taken from this, just food, energy and minerals, commodity prices are now 2.5 times higher than they were in the 1980s, and certainly far higher than they've been in the 20th century. And these commodity prices are twofold driven. One, rising demand, this new urban middle class, but two, how do you meet that demand from resources that are already stretched to deliver for 1 billion people, and now you've got 2 billion. And so there's the problem. Resource efficiency becomes a necessity as we move forward in time. And when I say resource efficiency, I mean in every form. Now when we look at a challenge like this politically, we know what sort of a challenge it is because we can no longer subdivide the challenges out. We need to be looking at all of this together. We need a systems analysis approach. And I know systems analysis is beginning to take off, but my God, it makes life difficult. Right? Trying to keep everything in sight. In the Middle East, there are massive subsidies for oil. So if you're paying the market price globally of $120 a barrel, you won't use oil to convert into fresh water. But if you subsidize it in your country at $5 a barrel, you will make fresh water from it. So you get all sorts of poor outcomes from attempts to make it cheaper for people to have water. Instead of using sunlight, every country which has a shortage of water happens to have a surfeit of sunlight. And yet there's no country using sunlight to produce fresh water on any scale whatsoever. So you've got this compounding problem of governments trying to deal with the problem with these subsidies and then making the whole problem a whole lot worse. Now, I won't dwell on this. Let's get back to the urban environment. In that period in government, as Chief Scientific Advisor, I developed and ran the in-depth foresight process we had. And this was one of the curves that we picked up in our report related to urban development. And it is now, I know, a very famous curve. The interesting thing is that for most of us, it's initially counterintuitive. If you plot energy usage on the vertical scale and urban density on the horizontal scale, you might expect something like a straight line, instead of which it's very hyperbolic. And so what this teaches us is that there's a kind of sweet spot for urban development in terms of urban density. That Houston is absolutely not the right model for the future of urban development. These very low density cities that were designed and built at the time of the development of the automobile are not fit for purpose, whereas the medieval cities of Europe, which were designed for people for walkability, let alone cyclability, those cities are much more fit for purpose to the 21st century. And so when we get into the developing countries and we find there's an attempt to imitate this behavior, it becomes quite difficult to overcome. The Hollywood image of what is best and what we ought to all be aiming for is difficult to overcome in talking about development. Well, that's what we see when we look at all those films from the United States. People in big cars driving all over the place. By the way, I think this is relevant because human health has got to be right at the top of our agenda in terms of urban development. I also did a study on obesity in Britain. And just for fun, we did a plot with obesity on this scale, and it matches this curve almost precisely. And so you can see why. People who don't walk, who don't cycle, who don't use physical activity in getting about their cities tend to be less healthy. So stress, please, in number one is let's redesign cities that are old, let's design new cities aiming at health as the number one factor in that development process. Let me just move on. That means, and this happens to be London, that means that we need cities with a mix in each part of the city of what is provided. This notion of dividing up cities into an area for restaurants, an area for shops, an area for businesses, I think really has to be completely put in there, the box marked the devil. And we need to move on to creating environments. When I'm talking in the developing world, I like to tell people to guess, as I show them photographs of different parts of London, which parts are the most expensive to buy a house in. And people tend to guess the areas that have low density housing. And then I point out that it's actually Chelsea and high density areas, but high density areas which are close to this sort of environment where large numbers of people can enjoy the amenities, close to restaurants, close to shops, etc. And here's, in my new job, I'm traveling an awful lot and visiting many, many cities around the world. This picture could be taken virtually anywhere. In a typical city in South America, I've just come back from, I would spend an hour between meetings just going around different government departments. And that is an hour in traffic that is simply not moving. Now this cannot be the right way forward. And it does mean that it takes quite a bit of thinking about how we avoid the attraction of every single individual jumping in their car every day and saying, I'm off to work. I give you this as an example, and some of you, I'm sure, know it already. But I'm going to tell you this is the same city, photograph taken from the same vantage point, just 3 years apart, same time of the day, same month and day of the year. So the city is Bogota. When I was in India recently talking about the same subject, I asked people in the audience to guess which city was which. And they all thought this was a Western city and this was India. It's the same city and it's in Colombia. So what happened was they had a visionary man, Enrique Peñalosa, and I'm just stressing here the importance of political decision making. Enrique Peñalosa was elected on a ticket which was people versus cars. And when he came in, he actually after 2 years they tried to impeach him. They thought their mayor was completely mad. So what he simply decreed was that for every 5 lanes each way, highway, coming into the city from 5 different suburban directions, he said the outer lane in future is for pedestrians only. The next lane is for bicycles only. The next lane is for buses that make many stops through the city. The next lane is only for fast buses that make a few stops through the city. And the last lane is for cars. And there's the transformation. And of course, what it meant was that the bus companies stepped in and provided from the private sector all of the transport facilities that were needed to deliver the goods. The cost to the city was apparently less than zero because of the saving in maintenance of roads and so on. And now, what is lovely about Bogota is that those outer lanes, the walkways, are now linear parkways going over the city. We've got these parkways with trees and grass, and people swagger as they walk along them in their best outfits. So you've got a transformative process which doesn't always require technology, doesn't always require finance. It does require 2 things. 1, a vision, and 2, the ability for a political figure to carry it through. And that is, both sides of that, very challenging. Now, I'm going to possibly make myself a little unpopular about high-speed rail. But this is just the kilograms of CO2 equivalent for people traveling in an SUV, by air and by rail. And one of the arguments that I think is seldom made about HS2 and HS3 is precisely this. That we now have reached a point of almost passenger saturation on most of our rail lines. Mass transit is absolutely critical, and so I think new rail track is as critical as anything else. And so moving forward with HS2 and HS3, the biggest single new development in intercity travel in Britain since the Victorian period is critically important. And of course the objective will be to reduce the number of people who travel by air as well, by providing fast rail travel. That argument that we can already get to Birmingham pretty quickly from London isn't the main point. The main point is to add passenger miles to the capability of travel. And we know in Britain that people choose rail because it is a much more efficient way of getting around than using cars. one more point I want to make, which is a very separate point, is the issue of waste. I was recently in Manila and talking about the more general subject, and so this is a waste tower in Manila. As a matter of fact, now in Manila they have followed the example of Kigali in Rwanda and banned plastic bags, because this is largely a plastic tower. What of course these create is a little community of people who live off the towers, but in practice we need to move into a situation, and this I think is a critical point, in which we consider that there should be no waste. As we move forward into a new kind of society, we must move away from the notion of waste. The linear economy of the 20th century was an economy based on taking commodities out of the ground, such as minerals, turning them into commodities facing the marketplace, and when they come to the end of the day, throwing them away. The circular economy has to be the better way forward, in which we no longer design manufactured goods with the purpose that they turn into waste at the end of their time. Every manufactured good in the future should be designed so that it can be replaced, remanufactured, recovered, and returned to the marketplace in a new form. And that is an interesting challenge, and I'm not sure if I've put it here. This is Dame Ellen MacArthur's focus on the circular economy, but interestingly, the Chinese Communist Party, quite important because the Politburo has to deliver what they say, has built the circular economy into their new Communist Party agenda. I think what I wanted to say was the development of a car, the first sustainable car that is built around the notion of the circular economy, has come out of the UK. The Gordon Murray designs T25 car, which is entirely made out of plastic bottles, and when it reaches the end of its time, you simply put the bits back into the beginning of the manufacturing process. The manufacturer takes something like 52 seconds to produce the chassis, which is one piece of plastic, a plastic mold. There's no bolts in it. The average car has 1,500 bolts in the chassis. And then they slap on the covers, drop in an engine, and you drive off in 5.5 minutes. It's a completely new manufacturing process. And as I say, when the car is in an accident or reaches the end of its time, it just gets put it back into the beginning of the process. It's a new way of thinking that can change an awful lot. And because we're on the subject of urban development, and I should draw myself to a close here, let me just say, and that applies to human waste as well. The city of New York generates about 1 billion grams of human solid waste. No, it's the New Yorkers who generate it. 1 billion grams a day. Now that is treated and put into the ocean, as it is in every city of the world. That 1 billion grams, 1% is phosphates and nitrates, which can be quite readily extracted and turned to commercial advantage. Nitrates and phosphates are energy intensive. Phosphorus are now becoming scarce and expensive. Both of them extremely valuable products. I'm very pleased to say that not far from here in Slough, they are now starting to extract phosphate. So what we need to do is look at every form of waste as a resource. Yes, what was I saying here? Future Cities Catapult. I'm chairman. It's a new body. It's one of the catapults started up by Biz, and these are companies, not for profit. We have a chief executive officer, 5 senior executives, a large building in Clerkenwell. We will be 70 staff by the end of this year, and the idea is that we're creating a space which is a working hub for all people who are interested in future urban development. People in the university sector, in the commercial sector, in the building sector, architects, but also critically mayors from around the world. We want to engage with the whole community, and there we will try to look at the whole issue of urban development from this holistic point of view that I just described. So future-proofing cities, absolutely central to that program of work. Low-carbon cities, cities based on reducing waste finally to a 0 point, all of this. We're looking at cities for examples of best practice, and here we will exchange best practice. So Singapore, I think there's a lot wrong with the development of Singapore, but one thing they are superb at is managing water. And so when we take an example of best practice, water management, we say we want Singapore to tell us how they do that. Every drop of water is treated as a precious commodity in Singapore. So there's the challenge. We're creating a global hub, a laboratory in London. It's both a hub for interaction but also a large laboratory so we can develop the next best practice. Policy influencers, makers, private sector, all players very welcome within that, and future-proof cities focused on the well-being of citizens. Thank you.